William the Conqueror is remembered as the man who built England. But the England he created was not born from speeches or noble ideals. It emerged from fear, hunger, and a landscape deliberately stripped of mercy. This is not the Norman Conquest preserved in textbooks or monuments. It is the version written into the soil by people who never had their names recorded. By the end of this story, what will matter is not who won, but how the victory was achieved, and what it cost those who never carried swords, because conquest does not end when the battle is over. That is when it truly begins. England in the early 11th century was not a united kingdom in any meaningful sense. It was a fragile patchwork of loyalties, rival nobles, shifting oaths, and regional power centers barely held together by custom rather than authority. Kings ruled, but their control weakened the farther they moved from their own estates. Law existed, but it depended entirely on local enforcement, which meant justice varied from village to village. Most people lived and died within a few miles of where they were born. Their lives followed the rhythm of harvests, weather, and obligations to local lords. They did not think in terms of nations. They thought in terms of survival, and that made them invisible when history later wrote about conquest. Across the Channel, in Normandy, a very different political culture had developed. Norman society was forged through constant violence. Its ruling elite were shaped by rebellion, suppression, and reward. Loyalty was not emotional, it was transactional. Service earned land. Failure meant annihilation. William of Normandy grew up inside this system. His authority had been challenged since childhood. He learned early that mercy invited rebellion, and hesitation invited death. By the time he turned his attention toward England, he did not think like a claimant seeking legitimacy. He thought like a ruler who understood systems of control. When Edward the Confessor died in 1066, England entered a moment of dangerous uncertainty. Competing claims overlapped, promises were disputed. Oaths were questioned. For England's ruling elite, this was a political problem. For William, it was an opportunity. The invasion that followed is often reduced to a single decisive moment. Hastings. Shields colliding, arrows flying, a king falling. But Hastings was not the conquest. It was only the opening. When William secured the crown, England did not submit. It resisted. Quietly at first, then violently. And this is where the myth begins to collapse. William did not attempt to rule England through persuasion. He did not trust its nobles, its customs, or its traditions. Instead, he imposed a foreign ruling class, backed by force. Castles rose where none had existed before, not as symbols of protection, but as instruments of intimidation. They were planted inside cities, looming over populations that had never asked for them. Resistance followed naturally. Local uprisings, refusals to pay taxes, attacks on Norman officials. Each act of defiance confirmed William's beliefs. England could not be governed gently. So he escalated. Norman warfare was not about winning battles. It was about breaking the capacity to resist. Villages suspected of supporting rebels were burned. Crops were destroyed deliberately, not in the heat of combat, but methodically, after decisions were made. Livestock was slaughtered. Food stores were emptied or poisoned. This was not chaos. It was policy. The goal was simple. Hunger spreads faster than fear, and lasts longer. A starving population does not rebel. It begs. By the winter of 1069, William unleashed the most infamous phase of his rule. Later chroniclers would call it the harrying of the North. The name itself softens what happened. Northern England was treated not as a rebellious province, but as enemy territory to be erased. Entire regions were stripped of their ability to sustain life. Fields were burned in midwinter. Villages were emptied. Survivors fled south or died where they stood. Years later, observers would describe stretches of land that still lay empty, long after the war had supposedly ended, not because people had moved away, but because they had never returned. The Domesday Book, compiled decades later, quietly confirms this devastation. Vast areas recorded as waste, not uncultivated, not abandoned temporarily. Waste. Land that produced nothing, because nothing was left alive. to Orchid. William secured his throne, but England paid the price. For the ordinary people caught in this transformation, conquest was not a single event. It was a slow collapse. Each season brought less food. Each year brought heavier demands. Norman lords replaced English ones. New laws arrived in unfamiliar languages. Justice became distant, enforced by men who did not know local customs and did not care to learn them. Fear became normal. Victory did not bring peace. It brought surveillance. Castles watched. Roads. Garrisons monitored movement. The countryside learned to exist under constant threat. William succeeded where many conquerors failed because he understood one brutal truth. Lasting control requires not admiration, but submission. By the time resistance finally collapsed, England was no longer the same society. Its ruling class had been replaced, its land redistributed, its culture bent under pressure. And yet, history would later remember William as a builder, a lawgiver, a founder. What those titles obscure is the reality beneath them, that England was not forged in unity, but in suffering carefully managed from above. And this raises the question that will define everything that follows. Was this the price of order, or the cost of conquest too high to justify? Because what William created did endure, but so did the scars. William's control of England did not solidify because resistance disappeared. It solidified because resistance became impossible. By the early 1070s, rebellion was no longer met with negotiation or compromise. It was met with systems designed to crush it before it could take shape. Castles were the backbone of this system. They were not built to defend the population. They were built to dominate it. Raised quickly from earth and timber, later replaced by stone, they sat at strategic points along roads, rivers, and population centers. From their towers, Norman garrisons could see everything, and more importantly, everyone could see them. These fortresses were reminders. They communicated authority without words. You did not need to read a proclamation to understand who ruled now. The castle was the law, and the men inside it enforced obedience through presence alone. Beneath this military network came a social transformation even more profound. English nobles were systematically removed from power. Some were killed in uprisings. Others were dispossessed, stripped of land that had been in their families for generations. Their estates were redistributed to Norman lords who owed their position directly to William. This was not random punishment. It was structural replacement. Within a generation, England's ruling class spoke a different language, followed different customs, and answered to a foreign king. English traditions did not vanish overnight, but they were pushed downward. Authority moved away from local familiarity towards centralized power. For the common people, this shift was disorienting. Lords changed, but obligations increased. Rents grew heavier. Forced labor became more frequent. Justice became distant and harsher. The law no longer reflected communal norms. It reflected conquest. Even rebellion itself began to change shape. Large uprisings became rare because they were suicidal. Instead, resistance turned quiet. Fields left untended. Taxes delayed. Information withheld. Small acts of defiance that could not be punished openly, but which slowly eroded trust. William responded by tightening control further. The Domesday Survey of 1086 was not simply a census. It was a declaration of ownership. Every field, every village, every oxen plow was recorded. Nothing existed outside royal knowledge. The land was no longer shared by custom. It was quantified, measured, and claimed. For many English villagers, this was the moment they realized something irreversible had happened. Their land was no longer theirs in any meaningful sense. It belonged to a system that could reach them anywhere. Yet despite the oppression, England did not collapse into chaos. That is the uncomfortable paradox of conquest. Order did emerge. Roads became safer under Norman patrols. Central authority reduced private warfare between nobles. Royal justice, however brutal, was consistent. This forced stability is what later generations would praise. But stability achieved through terror carries a hidden cost. Fear reshapes behavior. It discourages initiative. It silences dissent. It teaches compliance as survival. Over time, people stop imagining alternatives. The England that emerged after William was efficient, centralized, and durable. It was also deeply unequal. Power flowed upward, and suffering flowed downward. Norman lords lived in fortified comfort. English peasants labored under new burdens, adapting because they had no choice. Resistance had not failed because it lacked courage. It failed because the system it faced was designed to make courage irrelevant. William himself did not rule as a distant tyrant. He traveled constantly, enforcing authority in person. His presence was deliberate. The king must be seen. The ruler must be felt. But even he could not escape the consequences of the world he created. His reign was marked by constant vigilance. Trust was limited. Loyalty was enforced, not assumed. A kingdom built on fear requires endless maintenance. As William aged, England stabilized, but the scars remained. Cultural divisions hardened. Norman French dominated the court. Old English retreated into villages and memory. Language itself became a record of conquest, split between rulers and ruled. This was not the peaceful blending often imagined later. It was adaptation under pressure. By the time William died in 1087, England was no longer an Anglo-Saxon kingdom. It was something new, something forged by violence and preserved by structure. And yet, the question lingered. Had England been saved from chaos, or simply reshaped by force? Had order been restored or imposed? Was William a necessary architect, or a conqueror whose methods cannot be justified by their outcomes? These questions do not have simple answers. That is why the Norman Conquest still matters. By the time William of Normandy died in 1087, England no longer resembled the country he had crossed into 2 decades earlier. The landscape was familiar, but the power beneath it had been rewritten. The conquest had ended, yet its consequences were only beginning to unfold. What endured was not just a new king or a new ruling class, but a new way of organizing society. Land ownership had been centralized. Authority now flowed downward from the crown instead of upward from local custom. England had become governable in a way it never had been before. This is the uncomfortable truth that makes the Norman Conquest so difficult to judge. The same methods that caused mass suffering also created a durable state. William did not merely conquer England. He transformed it into something that could be controlled. The question is whether that transformation was worth the cost. Language itself bears witness to what happened. After 1066, English did not disappear, but it retreated. It became the language of labor, family, and survival. Norman French became the language of power, law, and prestige. Even today, this division echoes. The animals raised by peasants kept their English names: cow, sheep, pig. But when they reached the tables of the elite, they became beef, mutton, pork. The conquest still speaks through vocabulary. Law followed the same pattern. Norman legal concepts layered themselves over existing customs. Some protections improved, others vanished. Justice became centralized, predictable, and distant. The king's peace replaced local mediation. Disputes were no longer resolved by community consensus, but by authority imposed from above. For some, this brought stability. For many, it brought alienation. The Old English nobility did not vanish entirely, but they lost relevance. Power shifted to families whose loyalty was to the crown, not the land. Over generations, resistance faded, not because it was forgiven, but because it became unthinkable. The system worked too well, and this is where William's legacy becomes most troubling. He did not rely on cruelty alone. He institutionalized it. Fear was not just a tactic. It became infrastructure. Castles, laws, surveys, punishments, each reinforced the same message. Defiance leads to ruin. Yet, England did not remain frozen in terror. Human societies adapt. People learned how to survive within the new order. Intermarriage blurred divisions. Languages mixed. Norman rulers gradually adopted English customs, even as English institutions absorbed Norman discipline. Out of violence came synthesis. This is why William is remembered as both destroyer and founder. The England that emerged after him was stronger, more centralized, and more capable of projecting power. It would eventually build its own empire. But that future rested on foundations laid through suffering. History often asks us to admire outcomes without examining methods. The Norman Conquest tempts us to do the same. To look at modern England and say that whatever happened in 1066 must have been justified, because something enduring came out of it. But endurance is not morality. The villagers who starved during the harrying of the North did not consent to become building blocks of a nation. The families displaced from their land did not choose to participate in state formation. They endured because they had no alternative. And this matters, because conquest did not end with William. His methods would be studied, refined, and repeated, not just in England, but across history. Centralized violence disguised as order. Stability enforced by fear. Progress measured without accounting for pain. William himself did not die peacefully. His final years were marked by rebellion, mistrust, and constant movement. Even as king, he lived like a man guarding a fragile structure. When he died, his body was reportedly so swollen that it burst during burial. A grim, almost symbolic end for a ruler whose reign was defined by pressure. After him, his sons would fight over what he built. Power, once seized through violence, rarely rests easily. The conquest had created a state, but it had not created harmony. And yet, England did not collapse. This is the final paradox. A society born in brutality became capable of extraordinary continuity. Institutions outlived individuals. Systems replaced personalities. The Norman Conquest did not simply end an era. It inaugurated a model. That model asks an uncomfortable question of every generation that studies it. Is order worth the suffering used to create it? William the Conqueror forces us to confront that question honestly. Not as a hero or a villain, but as a man who understood power and used it without restraint. His success challenges the idea that morality determines outcomes. Sometimes efficiency does. But history is not a ledger of victories alone. It is also a record of costs. And the cost of 1066 was paid not by kings and knights, but by ordinary people whose lives were reshaped without their consent. The England we recognize today did not emerge from a single battle on a hillside. It emerged from years of calculated pressure, enforced obedience, and survival under a new reality. That is the true legacy of the Norman Conquest. Not glory, not destiny, but transformation through force. And understanding that does not diminish England's history. It deepens it, because it reminds us that nations are not born cleanly. They are built through choices, and those choices leave marks that last longer than any crown. If this story has challenged how you think about conquest, power, and history, then it has done its job, because the past is not meant to comfort us. It is meant to teach us what people are capable of when order is valued more than humanity. Tell me in the comments, what part of this story surprised you most? And if you want more history that looks past legends and examines the reality beneath them, make Suitage or Rest subscribe it, because the next story will ask an even harder question. And history, once understood, never looks the same again.